Welcome to another of the Centre for Economic Policy Research's video podcasts on the fast-moving impact of COVID-19. My name is Tim Phillips. Thanks to modern healthcare, COVID-19 might never become a catastrophic leveller like the Black Death was in England and Wales. But if it's a partial leveller, who suffers the most? If we know the probability of dying from COVID-19 is higher among certain deprived groups, what are the consequences if we ignore that message? A new paper in COVID economics analyzes the mortality from COVID-19. It argues that unprecedented economic and cultural class cleansing is occurring throughout the world during the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the authors is Tubadji of Swansea University, and she joins me now. Annie, welcome to Vox Talks.
Hello, Tim. Really my pleasure to be with you.
Now, Annie, during the pandemic, we've often heard that a virus doesn't discriminate by wealth or class. It sounds like you're arguing precisely the opposite.
Well, that is true. And there are a lot of facts that we ignore just because they happen without our direct intention. I'm a cultural economist, and my mission is to catch such kind of facts and to reveal them. And that's what me and my team are trying to do now in the case of the pandemic. There is a series of papers that we are working on, which are focused on revealing the cultural constructs which existed pre-pandemic and which are causing deep inequalities and even are on the way of create developmental traps in the future, which we do not expect, but which will potentially explode as economic and social nests of destabilization of our developmental process.
Yes, you've been analysing the impact on the economically, socially more vulnerable communities. As an economist, how do you define this?
Well, this particular paper showcases a specific methodology, which is called culture-based development. And it is an approach for value-free studies of values. So we do not define necessarily the discrimination. We stick to the things which are very clear for definition, and this is the categories of people. We define who belongs to a particular ethnic group, and this is a fairly standard demographic definition. And then we use methods, statistical methods, to measure the socioeconomic developments that happen to these groups. In this particular case, in this particular paper, we're looking to the most undeniable aftermath, which is death. So the vulnerability, the higher vulnerability to death is simply the higher percentage of death which happens to people who belong to this ethnic category. And what we find out with data decomposition methods in this particular case is that the people who are non-white do die more often. And this is something which has been documented throughout the world. And it was important to document it also for the case of the UK. And science has two big branches, right? The one is developing and finding new things, and the other is serving as an evidence-based tool for people. And I heard a colleague of yours posing this very important question on BBC. So her wonderful mission of ringing the bell for something important, this was Emily Meltis, for the presence of such kind of an inequality, provoked my responsibility to do my part of the job and just check the facts that for which she was ringing the bell and find out whether this is really the truth also in this country where I'm living and working. And the data supported what she alerted us about. It was also consistent with what we know from research for the States and other places around the world. So that's the first step, the first important take from this attempt to look at the important questions. That's why also we made the compromise with the data. If we were going just for making a fascinating research where we show the feathers of our ability and our existing in the scientific community methods, perhaps we could have ignored this data because the data that we use is known as data about deaths. And it is available on NUTS 1 level, and it's available on weekly basis, right? There is better, in terms of just statistical quality, better data about the people who just had some kind of a flu or whatever contagion and so on and so forth. It might be at a better statistical granularity available. But the point is that we wanted to ask the right question: who died? And with this data that could answer this question, we found our answers, which are the direct answers to the most important question: who really died the most?
Yes, a lot of the focus has been on the demographic aspects. I mean, particularly age, when it comes to mortality. You seem to have focused and found sort of pockets of regional deprivation and been able to tie this to particular communities.
Well, the culture-based development always looks on the individual and aggregate level. In this particular case, we have mostly aggregate data, and we have some kind of individual identifiers such as the ethnicity. What is being used is a method that is detailed decomposition, which can combine the identification of the deprivation and then to look at the different sub elements which explain this fact. Okay, so what is the age, what is the well the economic class or whatever other aspect you're interested in of the people that are concentrated in a particular locality can be factored in order to explain the division between the ethnic groups, between non-whites and whites. Okay, so this is the level at which we can look at it. And what we are doing is that we are applying the same very clear methodology, but we are defining the areas where people are living into areas which are deprived and areas which are not deprived. And in order to make this definition, we are using the multiple deprivation index, which is, again, a standard measure which exists, and it is produced on a regular basis for the UK and for England and Wales in specific, and it has information about income, employment, education, health, crime, barriers to housing and services, and living environment. So these aspects are being weighted, and there is a composite ranking of the areas, which is done on the basis of these aspects, and this ranking is the multiple deprivation index. So we are taking those areas which are above and those areas which are below the certain threshold of deprivation, which is the mean value for the country. And we're looking at the probability of dying if you're living in a more deprived area. And then it comes out again clear that the people who are living in more deprived areas are the ones that die off more often.
Over the last 3 or 4 years, we have seen some work around this, the idea that people in these left behind areas have worse health outcomes consistently. How much bigger is the death toll if you are in one of these deprived areas from COVID-19?
Well, this is exactly why scientists, journalists, and policymakers have to work hand in hand, because we have to inform each other where are the pieces of truth that we have best managed to capture, and what we have to take more serious from research efforts. In this particular case, with this data, what we have to focus on is the statistical significance. So we cannot insist on the magnitudes which have been found out. So I cannot responsibly tell you a percentage necessarily. But what I'm saying is that there clearly is a pattern in the data, and there clearly is ethnic and economic discrimination of people in the UK. And we have to look at this with better data, with the same method, in order to know whether the magnitude which we have found will repeat and will be confirmed, because that's how we can be sure by replicating and seeing that the findings are consistently present in the data, and triangulating it with that data sets. And also what is most important is to see what what are the measures that can be taken in order to support these people. Because the left behind areas are pockets of destabilization for the social, economic, political development of the country.
Yes, if we bring in politics to this, one thing you also do tie it together is is with the Brexit vote. In these left behind areas were areas that tended to vote for Brexit. The impact of COVID-19 has been higher among Brexit voting regions.
Yes, this is one of the findings which clearly comes through, and we have also linked it to the health system, the healthcare and health provision for people. We look at the historic variable of lung cancer patients, which obviously is related to the COVID-19, which it's related to the respiratory system, and we see how this is a reason why the COVID-19 deaths are able to explain the Brexit vote throughout the country. And we see that there is such a relationship. The most important thing here is to show to politics that it can monitor the degree to which it is pressing certain areas, to the degree to which certain areas are getting more and more deprived. There is a way to monitor this. There is a way to have this signal timely so that you can take measures and avoid the escalation of crisis. The Brexit vote is just one of the possible ways that political and socioeconomic behavior of people can be disrupted and can end up in a sort of a revolt. You see now what is happening in the States, a very sad occasion of taking the death of a person was turned from a peaceful protest into a violent behavior in some moments. And this is normal because people's normality is on a spectrum. And when you're pressing them persistently, this thing is recorded in the memory of people, but also in the memory of places. And there are places where a lot of pressed people, persistently exposed to this kind of mental health pressure, socioeconomic one as well, are bound to erupt into a destabilization of a system which is unfair to them. And if you are a policymaker, you have to have two main characteristics. The first is to care about the condition of people, the mental health condition, the socioeconomic condition under which you're putting them, and what you're making in order to improve their well-being, because that's why you're there, to be a politician, not to wear a hat or a suit and to take the glory of some fast low fruits that you can collect, but really to improve the well-being of people. And the second thing is to do this with enough visionary approach and enough responsibility to take decisions, but you shouldn't be a Machiavellian politician who is just doing the things for the sake of accumulating power, but you should do it with the proper, nowadays, modern, evidence-based approach of monitoring what's going on and understanding where the development of the whole socioeconomic system is going and preventing the things which are destabilizing it, ensuring that there is a stable and relatively equal developmental opportunity for everybody. Because if that's not the case, well, all empires have fallen, and it has been because of inequality. So no matter if you call it an empire today or not, it's bound to fall as a system, socioeconomic and political system, if it does not guarantee everybody's equal opportunity.
Politicians in the UK like to tell us consistently, they tell us this every day, that they're following the science. What you have here is some evidence about the many dimensions of deprivation that COVID-19 is pointing up because of the differing mortality rates. Are you saying that policymakers and politicians are becoming disengaged from this evidence because they're not acting on it?
I'm saying that they're very short-sighted in the sense of thinking about the problems as problems that occur now and have to be solved now because there will be a response now. And the things do not happen in this manner. There is a process. The process has memory. What has been done in the past kicks back in the reality now. So the deprivation, which was allowed to happen over the years and which continues happening nowadays, is creating the pockets of vulnerability in the whole system. When there is a crisis like the pandemics now hitting us, we cannot, as a system, we cannot survive well because some places break. We're like a ship in the sea, right? So if we have weak points and if the storm manages to break this point, well, the whole ship sinks. So that's our situation now. And these pockets are created by us. They're not natural phenomena. They're created by the way that we think, the way that our cultural biases have allowed it to happen. And then what has to be done is not only to have short-sighted policies and interventions now, but to put in place such policies that will create new conditions and will correct, maybe gradually, maybe over time, but will correct these socioeconomic inequalities in order to prevent vulnerabilities in the future. And this is much more important than just fast reactions in the moment.
Yeah, we like to make our interviewees into policymaker for the day, but in view of what you're describing, it's going to take more than a day to fix this, isn't it? What would you do?
Well, there is, as I told you, a whole series of papers on which we are working. And what I will do is to put in place a monitoring of the socioeconomic reaction to any kind of decision that I make on the way. One example, for instance, is the decision for reopening the economic system now. Do we again enact past or present discrimination in some manner? Some occupations were invited to start first. Now, if you look, and that's what we are doing in our next paper, if you look deeper into the characteristics of these occupations, they are related to particular, again, demographic characteristics. So you cannot ask the workers, for instance, the construction workers, to restart work when they're mostly male. Many of them are in bad health. Many of them are also ahead in age. So this is the most vulnerable category of people. And also, many of them are also not local, so they're not non-white. So these are the categories which are most vulnerable to the Brexit already, as we see from the first paper. So you cannot responsibly ask them to restart because this increases their vulnerability, this increases their exposure, for sure. And this, by default, is bad for the whole system for the simple reason that if we expose the people who are most vulnerable, they get infected, then there will be more people carrying the potential to get infected for the whole system. So this lack of altruism will kick back badly to all of us. So it is a chain of decisions that we're taking all the time, and each and every time that we're taking a decision, we have to implement the methodology of culture-based development, cross-checking whether there is a cultural bias, which we are now embedding, which will create further problems on the way, and will make a distinction between people on a fair basis.
Is this cultural bias particularly acute in England and Wales, where you did your research, or do you have evidence that it's repeated elsewhere?
Oh, well, actually, I'm based in Wales, but the research is for England. Mm-hmm. And there is evidence for this happening in other countries as well, if that's your question. But this kind of discrimination is known to exist, and it has been in the studies of inequality and cultural economics, and it is cultural bias and related to social constructs in so many ways. All the research of modern cultural economists, such as Alessina, such as Joachim Vogt, have shown this. But the problem is that when it comes to policy making, when it comes to also pure economic research, this has been sort of neglected. It's interesting, it will be published, but it's not taken responsibly enough in order to be corrected, and it has to.
Look ahead, Annie. If Brexit was a protest vote against deprivation in some ways, COVID-19 makes regions more vulnerable and people disproportionately feel the effects in deprived areas. Do you predict bigger protests? Do you predict there's going to be consequences?
This is again something which cannot be predicted straightforward from the data, but which is already known theoretically and empirically from other studies, that when there is a growing relative deprivation, so some groups are more deprived than others, this is bound to lead to social protest. So this is not just a question of common sense. Common sense also suggests it, but it is models which exist from the 60s and which have been confirmed. And actually the Brexit as a protest vote is just one illustration. It is not something novel to say that the Brexit was a protest vote. It was many other things, and that's why people studying Brexit have found also that it is related to education, that it is related to other factors, but also these factors are the endogenous factors which depend on our cultural decisions. And as we know from the latest work of Piketty on inequality, well, also the educational system is very much unequal. And if there is a fantastic illustration for Piketty's story about the inequalities in education, this is definitely the UK, isn't it? The division between the private schools and the schools for the poor, which also have completely different schooling and completely different results. And yes, there has been for Wales, but it's based on another study that we have. There has been a cultural discrimination in Wales, which is based on the Welsh Not, and which is the linguistic discrimination. The Welsh Not was obviously more severely implemented for people from poorer families, because these were the families that were speaking purely in Welsh. And so we're looking at the cultural persistence of the punishment related to cultural and ethnic belonging, and how the people from poorer background have suffered more from it, and how this has marked them in the past. We have historic data about this, and how this has persisted over time and carries marks places till nowadays, and creates pockets of deprivation within Wales.
Thanks very much, Annie. It sounds like there is a lot of work still to do on this. I suppose data's coming through all the time about this, is it?
Yes, I'm very much impressed by ONS. They really have generated very interesting new data sets. The one that I told you about, the basically cultural devaluation and depreciation of life, is based on related to the different occupations that were restarted first. This is based on a very nice data set that they released related to different occupations and the exposure that they have to communication with people, and how this is related with the infection rate and so on and so forth. There will always be an element of cultural bias, because the reality is socially constructed. And this has to be factored in when economic policy is made, because if it is not, it will keep replicating the injustice from the past, and this will be accumulating, and inevitably the system will break down. So this is the message of this paper.
Okay, Annie, well, we'll be looking out for the future work on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, the paper's in issue 13 of COVID Economics, and it's called Cultural and Economic Discrimination by the Great Leveller, the COVID-19 Pandemic in the UK. And the authors are Annie Tubadji, Don Webber, and Fred Boy. Annie, you've got another paper in COVID Economics as well, haven't you?
Yes, that's right. It is by the same team, although our team has also other members in it, and it's looking at the mental health. And it compares the mental health reaction of the public in 3 different countries. It was UK, Italy, and Sweden that reacted completely differently to the same negative economic shock, isn't it? So Italy was the most preventive one. They immediately started with the lockdown. We delayed much longer after them, and Sweden completely ignored it. So clearly, again, one can and must take into consideration the pre-shock conditions and also cultural conditions. So we compared the anxiety that these different societies normally experience with regards to death. And of course, there was cultural relativity, but then if you look at what their response to the shock was, it is very interesting to see that yes, there is different magnitude of the reaction in every country, but there are also spillovers. So the decisions which were taken in UK affected the uncertainty and the experience of anxiety in Italy and vice versa. So when there is a decision made, we should never forget that everything is related to everything else, and there are also spatial spillovers. We affect the people directly in our constituencies, directly in our country, but we affect the whole world. And there is a huge responsibility in this kind of decisions, because the social and the economic are connected. And people are vulnerable creatures. I have yet another research which comes much before before the COVID period, for UK, okay? And it is showing another example for mental health vulnerability. It is using the census 2011 data and the identification with witchcraft. And it seems that places that had this kind of subversive self-identification, religious self-identification, are the places which are more deprived. And basically this was yet another social indicator which appeared 2011, right? It predicts also the Brexit vote, and people normally laughed over it and thought it's a joke. No, it's not a joke. It is a social behavior which may seem at first sight unrelated, but if you look deeper, if you ask the questions why people behave in particular ways, and if you look also at the realities which are happening in the United States, they have also this prosperity gospel and flat earthers. There is a flat earth society here and so on. If you pay attention to this social cultural phenomena and see where they cluster in space, you can learn a lot about the socioeconomic conditions and tendencies for behavior, because the behavior of people comes from how they feel and how they reason, right? But mostly how they feel. And we also have evidence about this. The decisions that voting given is swayed much more by feeling rather than by reason. And reason is very bounded. And this is the reason for this is that people act under fear, under anxiety, right? This is evolutionary inbuilt instinct. And we always, from prospect theory, we know that we tend to respond to our fears twice stronger than to our reason, to our positive expectations. So it is normal also under pandemics and under any other kind of disruptions that our fear drives us into irrational and destabilizing even our own developmental path and the one of others. Not to mention the crowd effect. If there are more people who are in this destabilized situation, then the eruption comes much faster.
Yeah. Well, as you say, Annie, I mean, it's certainly not a joke. So let's hope that policymakers and politicians are alive to the evidence of the impacts of deprivation that's coming out of this. I've got a feeling that there's going to be some pretty important work over the next couple of years about it.
To take responsibility that they carry for the economic and for the mental health conditions of people.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Annie. And for the rest of you, you can keep in touch with our COVID-19 coverage of OxyU. We're adding to it every day. There's articles, podcasts, videos like this one, webinars as well. So from Annie and myself, and from everyone else at the CEPR, goodbye for now. Stay positive by staying negative.